Hey, welcome to Tabletop Skirmish Games. I'm Lee, and in this video, I'll show you how I painted the Necromancer from Legions of Nagash using contrast paints to a tabletop ready standard. Here's our Necromancer, and in this video I'll go through step by step how I painted him, and the idea with the whole Legions of Nagash warband is to make them really dusty and dirty like they come out of the earth. And that's exactly what I've done with all the skeletons from the warband. Here he is all primed, and I used the spray can, but I also went over with a brush just to make sure I got all the kind of hard to reach areas and made sure it's completely covered. And I used the Citadel Colour Wraithbone Contrast Undercoat Spray, and I also assembled the model using the Citadel Plastic Glue. The paints we'll use in the video will mostly be contrast paints, but we'll also be doing a little bit of dry brushing in this video, so you'll see that with some layer paints too. The brush I mostly use, and you could use for the whole paint except for the dry brush, is the Army Painter Wargamer character brush, but I've also been using the Kalinsky brushes lately, and they're really good. I can highly recommend those. Let's get started with our first contrast paint, the Snakebite Leather, and this is going to pick out all the leather straps, and we'll also do part of the book with this. And this is one of the really good contrast paints that gives a brilliant leather effect with just one coat. And most of these contrast paints are only going to need one coat, and they're going to give a real nice depth with a little bit of highlight on the more raised areas. I'm going in quite subtle here. I don't want too much paint on the brush, so I'm just making sure it's got enough paint on there that it's going to leave a nice coat and come off the brush easily. But I just want to give it one nice coat of this snakebite leather and get right in there. Some of the areas are hard to get to, so just keep moving the model. And then here I'm taking my time, especially on this book. This is like a leather bound book, so I'm just going along there, trying to avoid the pages so I don't have to tidy it up too much later on, but just going along the kind of cover of the book there. And there we are, that bit's done. And now I'm also moving up to this little leather pouch that's hanging from his staff, and I'll also cover all those straps as well, so there'll be and like bindings that hold in the skulls on, so I wanted those to be like leather straps too. So, and this is where this number 2 brush, I'm using the Kalinsky brush here, the number 2 is really good. And the next paint is the Contrast Wildwood, and this is going to go on that stuff. And again, another great paint. This one's quite dark, so you'll notice this is a lot darker than the Snakebite Leather, but it's perfect for doing wood, and even on the terrain is really great. But I do find with this, if you're doing like wood, it's nice to give a dry brush afterwards, and that really brings out the kind of grain and the texture of the miniatures, especially on the terrain, like on the walkways and the wooden like blockades and things that are in the catacomb set. This base of this and then a nice dry brush works really well, and you'll see this being dry brushed later, so you'll see exactly what that looks like. So at this stage I'm putting a fair bit of paint on my brush now. There's more on there than when I did the snakebite leather, because I'm going to be covering a larger area with each brush stroke, and the idea here is to start and end the brush stroke where you want most of that paint to build up. And you can also use like the miniature to drag the brush along and wipe off more paint in the areas where you want like a shadow to be in a recess, or for example where the staff is meeting his fingers, you're going to want a bit darker under there, so just guide that paint around. Right, now we're going to use some contrast Black Templar, and I'm starting with a hair here, and then we're also going to use this on the cloak. This hair's really fiddly, and this brush is slightly bigger than the Army Painter character brush, but that longer brush is actually really good for doing detailed work. You get like a real point to it, and it works a lot better. So I found that using a bigger brush, although it can be a bit counterintuitive at first, is much better for having more control. It holds more paint, but you also get a finer kind of point to the brush and just works a lot better. But now I moved on to the cloak, and I'm giving this kind of top part of the cloak, you can see where it's overlapping another section. I'm just going to give this one coat of Black Templar, and this is even more paint now on the brush than what we put on for the Wildwood. And so I'm really loading the brush up there and letting it go into the creases. And the great thing with a contrast paint is it wants to go in those creases on its own. So I put quite a bit on, let it go where it naturally wants to go, but then I also push it and pull it into the recesses so that I get that really deep shade. And then when I want the raised areas to be a bit lighter, it's naturally going to happen, but just to help it along, I kind of just take some paint off the brush on some kitchen towel, and then I come back and I like wick the paint up off the model and then push it around to where I want it to go. And then now I'm doing these little bits, so I've got less paint on my brush now, and this is almost the same as when we did the snakebite leather earlier on. And so I just want this to almost be as if you're drawing with like a felt tip pen, like a thick felt tip pen. I want that much paint to come off, because this is just for these kind of spikes that are coming out the back of his cloak. So you can definitely use the contrast paints for detailed pieces of the miniatures like this. You don't have to just put it on and spread it around. You can really kind of be fine with it and kind of precise, and it does work really great. It's not going to be as deep or as rich as, say, like a layer paint, use it like you would find in a traditional method, but you can still use it and get a good coverage when you're being quite careful with it and precise like this. It is going to be more prone to kind of run a little bit more, especially if you put too much on the brush, but don't worry about that, because you'll see throughout this video I keep going and tidying up the areas I've made mistakes on, and we're going to do that right now with some base white paint, and this is ceramite white. This is quite an old one. I think the new one is called Corax white, but any white base paint is going to do for this. And I'm just tidying up all the areas where I've kind of made a mistake and gone over into the different sections where I shouldn't have. And so I've got a little bit of this paint, and I just use a tiny bit of water just to wet that white paint down on a wet palette, and then that just makes it flow a lot easier. And again, it's all about control, so I want lots of control. And then I'm just going over all the areas, making sure it's nice and neat. And so what you don't want to do is put one contrast paint over the other, unless you're doing it for like a technique. But if you're doing it for different sections like this, if I put the red over the black, it's going to show through and it's going to look messy. So using this white at many stages throughout the miniature is going to leave it nice and crisp, and that's going to give you a really good finish. Now I'm taking some lead belcher, and this is a base paint. This is like a dark silver and a metallic paint. And there's not much metal on this miniature, so I'm just going to do this for the sword blade. And just be nice and careful, and try not to get it on any other parts of the model. Again, we can touch it up and tidy it, but you know, we don't really want to if we don't have to. So I'm taking my time and just giving this a nice even coat of that lead belcher. And I don't wet this down. This is straight from the pot and neat. And this is going right on there to give a nice coat. And then we'll cover this with some other paint later on, so you'll see that. But this will serve as like the great base for this. Now it's back to the contrast paints, and we're going with Blood Angels Red. And this is going to be for all the cloaks. You could use Fleshed Hairs Red if you want something darker and a bit more like blood-like. But I wanted this to be quite toned down a little bit, because we're going to dry brush it later to give that dusty, dry kind of effect, as if they've come out of this dry ground, this crusty ground. So I've chose this colour. Here again, like we did with the black, I'm putting quite a lot of paint on the brush, and I'm starting where I want most of that paint to build up. So I'm really pushing the brush into those cracks right in there where you'd get more of a shadow, and then I'm kind of just guiding that paint along and almost trying to make it run down the cracks and the recesses and pool in those areas. So we really want this paint to pool now and give us that deep, rich shadow. You've probably seen a lot of painters doing the Zenithal Prime, and I haven't started doing that yet. I've tried it once or twice, and to be fair, I quite like the technique and the finish that I get from just doing it like this. I like the kind of almost watercolour look that you get from the miniatures afterwards. But I think if I had an airbrush, I probably would go and try the Zenithal Prime, because I've just tried doing it by dry brushing. And but that Zenithal Prime would really help with cloaks, because you've got so many creases and so many like large spaces. And you can find sometimes with the contrast paint, doing large areas, you don't get a really nice even coat. And I've been experimenting with this on some other miniatures. I've been painting Zagra's Ravagers from Underworlds, and so that's been a good chance to practice and try some different techniques. For this model, one coat of this Blood Angels Red is perfect, and any little blemishes or areas where it's not quite perfect, we're going to cover up with dry brushing anyway. But I found that if you're going for like a cloak like this, doing one coat of the contrast paint and then mixing that contrast paint with 3 parts contrast medium and 1 part paint, and then doing a second coat over it, doesn't kind of take away the effect you want of the highlight and the shade, but it just smooths it out a lot nicer overall and does deepen those kind of shaded areas. So that works really well. But again here, we're just going to do one coat, and that's enough for us to get that nice deep like shadow, and with the dry brush is going to be fine. But if you want to see that technique, then check out the video coming out for Zagra from Zagra's Ravagers, and you'll see what I mean with the cloak, doing that one coat and then another coat over the top. But anyway, back to our Necromancer, and you see here now, in these areas, I'm not putting as much paint on the brush, because this is where we want that control, and I don't want it to go over the black, but where it meets it, it is going to overlap slightly, but that doesn't matter here. It works fine for that, and you haven't got to worry about that. And there's also a little bit of red cloth, so I'm just giving that a little coat and not worrying again about having too much on the brush, but enough to coat it. And there you can see now I'm dragging the brush along to get that paint off. Right, now we're going back to that base white paint, and it's time to just tidy up those lines again. When you're doing this, it's best to let that red dry, so that if you went on the white when it's not dry, you're just going to get pink. So yeah, make sure it's dry and then just go along and tidy it up again. And I take my time in these stages and really examine the miniature and make sure all the little areas are nice and neat. And you see on the hair, I'm having to go back and forth quite a few times throughout this miniature, but it's worth it. It's worth taking that extra time. Even though it's only tabletop ready standard, we still want it to look nice, and getting those lines crisp is the key to making this paint work. Once that white dried, it's back to the contrast black Templar, and then we're going to continue doing the cloak, this time all the inner parts of the material. And this is a great time to let you know about the new Patreon page I've set up if you haven't heard about it already. And this is a great place that you can support the channel if you like the content, and I'm committing to daily uploads now going forward, and I'd really appreciate your help and support for me to keep that going. The Patreon page is all about coming together, sharing our projects, voting on new videos and content, growing the channel together, and also I'm providing some monthly kind of materials that will improve your game, which will include like warband rosters that I've written, and top picks that includes names, narratives, backgrounds and more. And I'm also putting together custom fighter cards and ability cards that you can download, print and play. So the link's in the description below. Be awesome if you could check it out. Right, it's back to our Necromancer, and so we're finishing the cloak up, and the same principle. Get lots of paint on the brush, work it, start and finish the brush where you want most of that paint to build up, and then push and pull the paint around, making sure it goes where you want it to go. And then any areas where it's pooling, where you don't want it to pool, just take some of that paint off on a kitchen towel, and then wick up the excess paint, and then move it to a part of the model where you want that paint to go. I found that just following that kind of rule and then keeping it nice and crisp with the lines, you can get some really nice effects with this contrast paint. Right, now we're on to Contrast Agarus Dunes, and this is a great paint. This is going to give us some kind of old weathered look on the pages of the book. And so we're just making sure I get all around the book there. So I'm moving the model as much as I can to get in there nice and easy. And now we're on to some Bugman's Glow. And this is a base paint, and I've got these very vegan makeup brushes, and these are perfect for dry brushing. These are really soft bristles, and it's just perfect. As soon as I got these, my dry brushing game went right up. So I can highly recommend getting some makeup brushes, and they're cheap too. These are like £3, I think, so well worth it. And you can see here what I'm doing to dry brushes. I'm getting some paint on the brush, and then working as much as I can into the bristles and getting it off on a paper towel. And so this is dry. That's, obviously it's dry brushing, but you want this really dry. And when I first start putting it on the model, I'm starting from the bottom here, because I want this isn't to give us a highlight. This is to make it look dusty, as if he's come out of this crusty, dry, dusty earth. So I'm starting at the bottom. And when I first start dry brushing, I've got to make sure there's not too much paint on the brush, or it's not wet. And so I go quite tentatively on there, making sure I know how much is going to come off the brush. And then when I'm confident that the brush is just right, I start being a bit more liberal, a bit rougher, but it's just having that nice downward motion with the kind of brush strokes. Let the brush do the work, and then just build it up slowly. And you can keep doing this. You could add one layer, then add another if it's not enough, but just gentle, take your time, and make sure it goes into all the areas. Doing this dry brush like this is going to completely transform this model. So it's taken that kind of bright red, and really dirtied it up. So that's sort of what I wanted to go for here. I didn't want anything bright. I wanted it really dusty and dirty, and I think it kind of did the job here. We'll do another colour in a minute. So this is like just one one dry brush, but we'll put another dry brush over the top, which is a bit lighter. And then that will kind of act as a little highlight then, the next stage. But really, we want this dusty effect. I think there's lots to explore with this technique of using a contrast paint as a base and then doing a dry brush over the top. And this is something I'm really going to be doing a lot more as I work through different miniatures, trying out these different techniques. And when I did the Sylvaneth, if you haven't seen them already, they're up on the channel, so you can see those painted. Then I did the dry brush on them, and it worked really great. I think you just go over it with the wood paint, the wildwood, then a dry brush, and you get an instant effect. And with the Sylvaneth, that was for more of a highlight and to bring the texture out, but again, this one to make it dusty. Right, now let's get some Rakarth Flesh, and this is a base paint as well. Same thing, I didn't clean the brush because we're going straight back on, and most of that paint will be off by now, but I'm getting it loaded up, working it into the bristles, getting that paint off on the paper towel, and now I'm going to go over, again, really careful at the first bit because I don't know how much paint is on the brush, and then when I'm used to it, go over it again. And I don't go too crazy with this. I don't go on over the whole model now. I'm just picking out the more kind of pronounced or raised areas. And this is going to add to that dusty effect, but it's also going to give a little highlight, change the tone a little bit, and just break things up. And you can see I've gone over the hand and the head, and there's just no way around that. I'm not going to be able to stop that now at this stage. I probably shouldn't have done the hair yet, but you'll see later we tidy it up anyway. It gets tidy, so that's no problem. But now I'm going in, getting all those bits. And with this, I also do some on the wood. So we'll do the wood as well. And this is the paint I use on all the wood, this Rakarth Flesh. Really great. Bit of wildwood as a base, the contrast. Then Rakarth Flesh, dry brush, and those two work really nicely together. So I continue to do this now, all over, and then really focusing on those areas that would kind of drag on the ground and collect most of the dust. So with this video, we're going pretty much real time, except for paint drying. No one wants to watch that. And but on some of the others, they go quicker. So what I tend to do when I do a warband is I'll do like the main like leader or the main like favoured warrior, and I'll spend more time on them on the video. So you'll see a lot more of the process. But then as we go through to like with the skeletons, they'll get quicker as the videos come out. So if you like a quick video, then there'll be loads of those. If you like the more slower ones that are almost real time, then the leaders are going to be mostly like that. And I think that's good because it shows you how quick this method can be. You know, one coat mostly of each contrast paint and a dry brush, and we can get some really nice effects. And for a tabletop ready piece, I think it's really good standard to go for. And tabletop ready can be good. It can be a good standard to aim for. So right, let's get on with some more of that tidying up with that white paint. And you see I'm going back over the head now. So I've done this a few times. I probably could have done this maybe in a more kind of efficient order, but I didn't, so I'm going back over with the white now and just giving that a nice coat, and that's going to be ready for when we put some flesh colour onto this. So lots of tidying up here between the stages for sure. So you probably the stage I did before, once I'd done the red, didn't really need to do. I could have left that out. So if you're copying this, then yeah, just learn from my mistakes and just cut out some of the stages of tidying up. But it doesn't matter. I mean, you could keep tidying up as much as you like, no problem. And again, it's crisper. It's going to look better as you're doing it. You're going to pay attention to the details a lot more. So yeah, no problem. So once that's dried, it's the time to take some more of the snakebite leather. I'm just going to go over those straps now. I think I missed one out earlier, so I'm going to make sure I cover that and also just tidy up some of the other ones. Make sure it's all nice and neat. And in those areas where there's like knots, I just give them a little dot each. Just adds a little bit more like depth and darkness to it, a bit more shadow. So you can layer the paints up for sure in areas like this. On big areas, like I said with the cloak, I found that just using that contrast medium makes it really nice. But for small areas where you want that extra bit of like shadow, then it's no problem just to put another coat on. Next, we're going to take some Skeleton Horde contrast paint, and this is great for all the skulls and bones. And this is, again, one coat, and it looks dark when it first goes on in some areas, but it dries quite pale. So in the eye sockets, I really put quite a lot in, and it looks like I put too much in. But once that dries, that gives you a really nice shadow in the recess. But a nice even coat all over the other areas. And I really go to town on those eye sockets and put loads in. You can see there, it's full. It's completely full. So there's quite a lot of paint going on. And that'll just give the contrast we're looking for. So once you follow like the kind of rule of starting and ending the brushstroke where you want most of the paint to build up, and then push and pull it around. And then as you go through the miniature, just keep doing that tidy up stage and make sure all the lines are nice and crisp. Once you do that, you can get some really nice effects with the contrast paint. But then it's really learning the paints because they can be very different. Like you use the wildwood or the black and they're really dark, deep, rich paints. But if you use something like this skeleton horde, it's going to act completely different to say the snakebite leather. It's going to be a bit paler once it dries. And then you've got other paints, like there's some different greys that can be very thin. So it's just experimenting, practicing, trying out the different colours. And then once you've got used to the paints and then follow these techniques, you're gonna get some brilliant results. Right, so now we're going to take some contrast Guilliman flesh, and I'm putting this all over the hands and the face. And so any areas of flesh we can see is going to get a coat of this. So this guy's pretty pale. He's done some dodgy spells and it's really took it out of him. So we don't want him to look like skin tone, but we do want him to have some nice shadow in the recesses and around the eyes and the mouth and nose and things like that. So this is almost going to be like a background shade, and we're going to cover this again with another dry brush later on. So this is just to give us a base and to give us a bit of shadow and a bit of depth to it. And you can see here, I'm just wiping the brush against the grain of the fingers so that it takes the paint off. And then that paint gets almost sucked into those recesses on its own. It really wants to go in there. So I'm just using that brush against it. And then while that's drying, I'm going back to the base lead belcher. And there's a tiny, tiny bit of metal up here, like a little disc that I didn't notice earlier. So I'm just giving that a quick coat and then do that on both sides. And then we'll cover that with a little bit of contrast paint later on as well, just to change the colour. And that's a good technique too. Right, now we're going back to contrast skeleton horde. And here now, while all the other areas we just painted are drying, I'm just going to start on the base. And so I'm giving it all a nice thick coat. I'm putting quite a bit on. You can see it. As soon as I touch it with a brush, it like sucks it in. So it's sucking all that paint into those recesses. And so I'm giving that a nice coat, skeleton horde. And then I'm going to take some red 0.926. And this is by Vallejo. Any deep, rich red is going to work. But I really like this colour. And I'm putting this on while that skeleton horde's wet, because I'm not too worried about it kind of mixing together. And you'll see why later on. But I'm just popping it all on there. And this is the similar colours or the same colours I used on the skeletons from the Legions of Nagash Warcry for their bases. So it's all going to tie in. And the idea was, again, that floor is all cracked and dry, but it's all blood soaked. So it's all dried blood from an army that was kind of killed there. And the necromancer's come along and he's kind of raised this army of skeletons from the earth. And they've come through all this dry blood, dust and sand and years of dust and just come through. And so they're all kind of covered in it. Right, so now we're on to some ceramite white, the base paint. And this is dry brushing. So I've got this really scruffy brush where all the kind of bristles are just ruined really. But it's a nice soft brush. So I'm doing the same technique, loading it up, and then really working it into that to get most of the paint off. And then I'm going to go against the grain over the hands, the head, and this will give us a nice highlight and make that flesh really pale and gaunt looking. I think maybe white might be too bright. I like it white, but if you don't want it too bright, then maybe something like a pallid witch flesh, or take some white and just like bring it down a touch with a little bit of like orange, tiny bit to bring it down, or a little bit of beige. But I thought the white worked really nicely because it's just so exaggerated. And I was looking at the picture in the book and on the cards, and he is quite pale. But I think maybe what I could have done if I didn't have any, but if I had the pallid witch flesh, I might have done a dry brush of that first, and then done a very gentle white over the top of that. And that might have been a nice couple of stages to do rather than just go in pure white. But again, that's up to you and your preference, but I was happy how this turned out. And here I'm just doing downward strokes, so I'm just going down and then across the top of the head as well. And now you see I'm going to have to go over that hair again later on, but that's okay. So I'm just going down. So I don't want this to go into the eye sockets or the mouth or even the cheek, in the kind of cheek recesses. I want it to just go on all the raised areas. and also on the hand here. I'm trying to avoid that skeleton and the work I've previously done on the cloak, so I'm being really careful, and only a few of the bristles are touching this at a time, but enough to give us that highlight. And you can see where the hand meets the skull, that kind of skeleton horde and the Guilliman flesh is going to give us a nice shadow. But there he is. Now he looks more kind of necromancer-like, a lot more paler. Now we're taking the Black Templar again, and this time we're going to use it just to tidy up that hair. This is where the larger brushes really come into their own. We want to get that detail, so using that long brush with the really pointy bristle is going to allow us to just like use the tip of the brush and then just gently flick it down that hair, and that's going to give a real nice fine finish. And so yeah, definitely the bigger brushes, and these Kolinsky brushes are great, and they can get synthetic ones as well, so they're really good. So I'll be trying some different brushes as I get going, but I am finding with the Army Painter one, it's not holding up as well as the Kolinsky ones, so it's starting to lose its edge a little bit. But I'll let you know how it does and how it keeps going over time, because I've been using it a few months, so it's doing well. Okay, so now that base has dried, I'm going to get some Agralan Badland, and look at this. This is like a really sandy, thick texture. It's almost like sand, PVA, and kind of paint mixed together. And I'm just spreading that on, and this is what I used, exactly the same colour as well as I used on the skeletons. And so I'm putting this on. I'm using a toothpick. You don't want to use you can use a brush. I wouldn't. It'll kind of ruin it. So I'm using a toothpick. You can get like a little spreader from Games Workshop if you like, but I find the toothpick works really great. And I'm going in, and I kind of want this all to blend in now. I don't want the skulls and bones he's standing on to be too pronounced. I want the whole base to blend together. So I'm really working this up towards that raised area, pushing it in, and then spreading it a bit flatter as I get to the edge or the rim of the base. This takes a little while to dry, a lot longer than a paint would take, so give it an hour or two, get it really dry before you go over it. And with these you can use straight away or paint them. But now I'm using its kind of brother, if you like, the Agralan Earth, and this I'm applying with a brush. Now this is the paint that I used on the skeleton bases, and once you put this over, say a red like this, and you put it on really thick onto a base, it will crack and give that crackle effect, and then the colour from underneath will come through those cracks. But here I'm putting it on pretty thin, so we're not going to get a crackle effect here, but I want the colour to match this, match identical to this, so I'm using it just to cover up the kind of bloody area bit, and a little bit still going to come through as it dries, but not much. You're not going to see much of this red, and it's certainly not going to crackle. But so this is really, I'm just using this as a paint really. I've done a separate video on the bases so you can see it actually in action. Okay, now I'm taking the beige brown 0.875 from Vallejo. This is a great paint, nice colour, and I'm just using a bit of blue tack, and I put it on the end of the Very Vegan makeup brush, and this acts like a little turntable for the miniature then to go on. And I'm just giving this a nice thick coat of this paint. And I find with the Vallejo paints, they tend to dry a little bit slower, but some of the colours are really nice. And I picked up the Vallejo starter set just to get a nice palette and a nice variety of kind of the main bold primary colours and some metallics and things like that. And some of the colours are really nice, and I find this beige works really well. Right, now we're taking some Ushabti bone and that vegan brush again, and we're going to do some dry brushing on the base. And you don't need to use the Ushabti bone. If you've got a beige, you could just add some white to it and mix a paler version of it, and then that would work just as well. But here with the dry brush, again, same thing, load it up, get most of the paint off, and then here, once this base is completely dried, I left it overnight, so the next day it was really dry, but a couple of hours is going to do, and then I just go against the grain. And I didn't do this on the skeletons, I thought I'd leave them and see how they got on, but after playing with them a couple of times, then I did go and dry brush them, and this makes a huge difference. It really breaks it up, gives it a lot more kind of dimension to it, and it's a nice way to finish these off. So I'm just going along there. I'm not worried about it hitting the rim because we'll give it another coat later. Now we're on to the final stage. We're taking some of that beige brown 0.875 by Vallejo, and I'm going to give that coat all along the rim. You can see it's darker all of a sudden. It's gone brown. I tried a darker brown just to see what that would look like, but I didn't like it. So now I'm going over it with this nice beige colour again, and I'll do 2 coats of this just to get it nice and sound. So I'll do a coat, let it dry, and go back with another coat. And I'm putting it on really thick here, and so that's going to give it a nice finish. When this dries, it's going to look quite similar to the base that we've done, but enough to break it up, and it is a nice way to finish off the miniature, I think. And here we go, so just finishing that along, spinning it on that brush. This works great, little turntable, and then I hold the brush sideways, and that gets it nice and neat. And there we go, there's our finished miniature, the Necromancer, all painted to a tabletop ready standard with some contrast paint, lots of dry brushing, and I'm really happy with the result. I think it's really cool to combine the contrast paint with some dry brushing, and you can see on the cloak we've almost got like a little fade going on. It just looks really nice and really quick and easy to do. So the main thing, just making sure that brush is nice and dry. But there we are, and this also kind of brings the black in with the red, ties the whole model together. And with the white on the face, he might be too pale, but I'm happy with that. I like it. And here's the base I was talking about for the skeletons, so you can see that real crackle effect, how that's worked. And I've done a separate video on those bases if you want to check that out. And so that video is on the channel too. And the kind of paints I've used here, the colours, a few different techniques on the skeletons, but most of the colours are going to be the same. And I've done a separate video on some of the different skeletons, including the champion, this guy, the seneschal, and a regular kind of soldier. And I chose to do one with this guy, the spear, because he had some nice effects, and with the wood on the shield, I thought that was a good one to use. I'll put links to everything we used in this video in the description below, and there'll be affiliate links to Element Games, but they won't cost you anything extra. In fact, they could save you up to 20% on all the products there. And for every sale made through an affiliate link, I get a small commission, and that's going to help me develop the channel and create more videos like this. So thanks so much for that support. I really appreciate it. Thank you also to everyone who's come along and joined the Patreon page. It's been brilliant to have you there, and it's been great fun talking to you in the Discord channel, and I can't wait to provide all the cool benefits that are going to come with that. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. It's awesome to get your feedback and comments, and it'd be great to hear from you. If you want to see this guy in action, then check out Battle Report number 3, where he takes on the Corvus Cabal. But that's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. Please like if you like it, subscribe for more videos like this, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to join me next time on Tabletop Skirmish Games.